up dragging in here 2 minutes late. Good morning to everybody joining us at home or here. I don't blame you for being home today. It's kind of rainy and yucky, but I appreciate everybody who is here, brave the elements. We are in our Sunday morning Bible class. We have been walking through the Gospel of Matthew. That is where we are once again this morning. If you're joining us for the first time, we're in chapter 23. And so if you want to go ahead and be turning over there, chapter 23 is in the final week of Jesus' life. He has come into Jerusalem and made a big splash. He came in with a lot of fanfare and attracted a lot of attention. Then he went straight into the temple, turned over a bunch of tables, made even more of a splash. And then in the last chapter, he's had a number of groups of religious leaders come to confront him, to test him, to ask him questions. And this chapter 23 is following that section. Different groups of religious leaders have questioned him. They've tried to test him. They've tried to trap him. And he has silenced, or as we talked about last week, muzzled all of them. And this is where we are at this point as he is going to now issue some indictments of these same religious leaders. So if you have your Bible, go ahead and turn to Matthew 23. We're going to pick up in verse 1. Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, whatever they tell you, do, and comply with it all. But do not do as they do, for they say things and do not do them." Now, this is interesting because most of us don't expect Jesus to say that you should listen to the scribes and the Pharisees. We have this tradition where, he is kind of adversarial with the scribes and the Pharisees. And so for him to say you should listen to their teaching, and so we kind of ignore that first part and jump straight into the other parts. But I want to stop there just for a second because there is something significant of that. A lot of modern interpreters and preachers will jump straight over that to get into the hypocrisy and the indictments and all the things that they don't do. But Jesus is critical of the Pharisees, but he's really critical of them for their lack of follow-through with their own teaching. He's really critical of them because of how they live rather than what they teach. He's not critical of them for keeping the law. And a lot of teachers will hold this up, that Jesus was somehow anti-law. And you'll hear that the law was this shackle that was on the people, and Jesus was, but I don't see that in Jesus' teaching. When Jesus teaches, he says, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. He says that the law is there for the benefit of the people. It's not a burden. The Pharisees have made it a burden. Do you get that breakdown? He's gone from, it's not that the law itself is bad, but what they have done. He criticizes them earlier in chapter 15 for preferring their own traditions over the law itself. And so it's like, in this passage as well, Jesus is going to be critical of their actions more so than their teachings. Their teachings is not necessarily the problem as much as it is their practice. The observance of the law becomes a burden because of their practice and their traditions, because they add all this stuff to it. Matthew characterizes Jesus as the pinnacle teacher and interpreter of the law, and the Pharisees serve as kind of in literary terms, a foil against Jesus' interpretation of the law. Jesus takes the law and says, y'all are missing the point. You're worried about the minuscule letter of the law when you should be worrying about more the heart of what the law is trying to teach. That's pretty much the whole of the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said, but I tell you. He says the law is one thing, but you're missing the point. You're not going far enough, and you're getting bogged down in all this minuscule stuff. He says the Pharisees don't practice what they preach. That's a, well, I'm sorry, I lost my place. That's a big thing, because he says they don't practice what they preach, but they sit on Moses' seat, which is the seat of those who would interpret the law, who would administer the law, and that they should be listened to and submitted to. Now, I think there's something interesting there, because that's very different than a lot of our, and when I say our, modern day Christianity's understanding of how we relate to authority. Especially in the church. How is that different? How do you see that as being different? Jesus says, listen, the Pharisees are in a position of authority, and because of that, you should do what they say to do. Just don't do what they do. And I think that's very different than a lot of our modern day Christianity's understanding of how we interact with authority. And maybe I'm wrong. Jason, what do you see there?
I don't know if it's necessarily the change in the church. The first thing that comes to my mind is rules for me, but not for thee.
Jason said, rules for me, but not for thee. That I'm gonna put things on you that you should do this and this and this, and then I may not myself do them. Okay, I buy that. What else? Anybody? How is this different from the way people respond to authority now? I grew up in church. I've watched a number of church splits, and so I still carry the trauma and the baggage from that, because those are some horrific things to go through. Nick, you had your hand up. Okay.
They have the best seats, the best food, but they don't practice what they preach.
Ooh, very good. Nick was comparing it to government. We have the best seats and the best food and the best places, but you don't necessarily practice what you preach. Okay, and I buy that. That's exactly applicable to what he's talking about. In churches, our specifically, let's talk about us, because we're not familiar with everybody else's hierarchy of authority, and so I don't want to go there. But in churches of Christ, we're under a plurality of elders, and that is our leadership. And in my experience, there are a lot of people who are willing to rise up and to buck or rebel against that. And when they have a disagreement of whatever kind. And that's unfortunately not scriptural. And you know, there's a place where you get to now where maybe you are under leadership that you can't tolerate, that you can't agree with. And that's going to happen. But in that position, I liken it to David and Saul. David says, I'm not going to raise a hand against the Lord's anointed. Saul was just about as far gone as you could get. I mean, he's consulting witches and trying to kill him. I don't know that you can get very much further than that, but David still wouldn't raise a hand against him, because he is in a seat of authority that's given to him by God. And so the only avenue that he has is to leave. I've been in situations where I disagreed with my eldership. And there comes a time when that disagreement, you know, there are very few hills that I want to die on, but every once in a while you will get to something and it is such a fundamental disagreement. Well, my job is not to cause division in the church. When I get to that point, if I can't get over that, then my responsibility is to remove myself from that authority, not to try to usurp it or to overthrow it. Jesus doesn't say, you know, you should rebel and overthrow the Pharisees and change the way everything's done. He says, listen to what they say, but not necessarily what they do. I think we jump over that, and that's easy for us to get past. We have to look for, I guess, marks, you'd call it, of authentic teaching, marks of authenticity in people's lives that first we're going to look for that you live according to what you teach. Does that make sense? And now I'm teaching, and I tell you I don't always hit the mark. I'm going to be totally honest about that. But I'm not going to stand up here. I grew up in a generation of preachers that was always all the sermons were you. You remember that? Is that just me? Maybe that was just me. But it was always you. And he was telling all of us what all we were doing wrong and how we needed to straighten up. I can't do that because I know what my personal life is like, and I know that I'm not perfect, and I'm not hitting the mark, and there is no room for me to say you. I say a lot of we and us because that's the way I feel. And so we're looking for authentic teaching. People that are, hey, I'm trying to do this just like y'all are trying to do this, and I fail just as much as everybody else, but we're in this together, and we're trying to make it. You know what I'm saying? Not that there's still preachers like this today. I see them online when I watch a lot of sermons, listen to things when I'm riding in the car or whatever, and you'll come across some, and they're quick to point those fingers, and those are usually the ones that in a couple years you'll hear something about because you're not living in congruence with what you're teaching. Does that make sense? So one mark of authentic teaching is that they are trying to live according to their own precepts. Jesus is going to employ the term hypocrite 6 times in chapter 23 and several other occasions throughout Matthew. So I guess we've got to start with defining some terms. What is a hypocrite? Says one thing and doesn't do it himself. Literally, the Greek word Hippocrates was used about actors. It was someone who wore a mask. That was the literal definition of a hypocrite. Because you remember Greek theater, y'all remember some of this from high school? They all wore masks. And you would have, different people playing different roles, and they would put on the mask, and that was how you decided who was who and whatnot. And so when he's using that, this is an actor. This is someone who's wearing a mask, someone who is pretending. And so when he's calling them this is a term that was used in their society for an actor or someone who was playing a role. Whereas Jesus now spins it around and uses it as a indictment, if you will, of these teachers who are professing one thing but living a different way. So Jesus is catching them and calling them out for the way that they live and the things that they do in response and in contrast to the teaching that they pass down. I think it's second mark of authentic teaching is that teachers don't promote their own status. One of the most embarrassing things for me is when somebody will catch you and they'll be like, "Oh, you," and I'm like, "No, it was not me. It's God. These are God's words. I'm just the mouthpiece, right? I don't have any ability to touch people's hearts or to change people's lives. And if that happens as a result of something I said, that's the Holy Spirit. It's not Jeff. I don't want to take that authority, or I don't want to take that glory away from God because that's not mine to take. But there are a lot of preachers who get into what I call the entourage theory, and whether that's whoever you want to think about, Elvis, Michael Jackson, Mike Tyson, whoever you want to think about. When you get an entourage around you, and a group of yes people who always tell you how great you are, sooner or later you start believing it, right? And that's how you come back with rhinestone jumpsuit or a face tattoo, because nobody's going to tell you that's a stupid idea. But preachers fall into the same thing because they stand at the back of the building every Sunday morning and all these people come out and tell them how great they are. And after about 5 or 10 years of that, they start believing, I really am that great. And they're not. And it's easy to get sucked into that and to get sucked into this thing that somehow I'm this great thing, and I'm not. Jesus is going to he's going to indict these, but Matthew is using these woes, and we'll get into that word in just a second, but he's using these woes and these proclamations. If you look at it and back up and think about his readership, he's writing this somewhere around AD 90 maybe. That date is fluid, I know, so we're not going to play with that because that's a whole nother class. But somewhere around AD 90, and if you think about what's happening in that time, there is Jews, and the Jews are in contrast with the church, with the Christians. And the Christians are Jews who've now following Jesus, most of them. There are a few Gentiles, but for the most part. And so those two groups are kind of butting heads. And if you'll notice in here, Matthew uses this as sort of a commentary on that structure and what's happening in the world around him. Now, I'm not saying... I'm saying Matthew, but it's through the Spirit. This was a common, the Pharisees were a common group to pick on, okay? Barclay talks about in the Talmud that the Talmud says, it has this joke that there's 7 different types of Pharisees. There's the shoulder Pharisee who wears all his good deeds and righteousness on his shoulder for everyone to see. There's the wait a little Pharisee who always intended to do good deeds but could find a reason for doing them later. There's the bleeding Pharisee who was so holy that he would turn his head away rather than look at a woman, and therefore he was constantly running into things and tripping and falling down and hurting himself. There was the humpbacked Pharisee who was so humble that he walked bent over all the time, showing everyone that he was in prayer and how humble he was, and therefore he couldn't straighten up anymore. There was the always counting Pharisee who was always busy counting the good deeds and the things that he had done and couldn't be troubled with anything else. The fearful Pharisee who did good because he was terrified that God would strike him with judgment if he did not. And finally, the God-fearing Pharisee who really loved God and did good deeds to please the God that he loved. And that's from the Jewish writings of the time that this was a joke about the Pharisees as a group of people. And so as I read that, I'm like, would there be different types of Christians today? Would we have Christians who would fall into different categories? We're not going to do that because that's kind of, a whole different direction than we really want to take. However, it's an exercise worth playing with because Jesus is going to condemn these guys. Now, before we jump into that, remember the Pharisees they're not a joke. These guys are people who take their spirituality, their religion very, very seriously. There are a number of stories where there's one story where the Romans wanted to come parade through Jerusalem, and the Pharisees said, no, you can't do that because they didn't allow any graven images. And the Romans would carry these banners with Caesar's image on it. And the Pharisee says, you can't do that. And the Romans said, well, you don't get to tell us what to do. We're the Romans and we can do whatever we want to. And the Pharisees said, well, yeah, but we're going to block the road. And so they lined up in the road, and the Romans come up and they say, if y'all don't move, we're going to chop off all your heads. And the story goes that the next morning, the Romans get up to march through, and the Pharisees are lining the roads with their robes pulled back and their necks extended. And so, I mean, these guys aren't no joke. They're the real deal. I mean, they're taking their stuff seriously. And so, I mean, we also give them this bad rep that they're these bad guys of the Bible who are out to get Jesus, but that's not true. They did see what they were doing as gatekeeping and keeping the faith. They wanted to protect their religion from this guy who was a blasphemer and proclaiming himself to be the Messiah. And so they are coming into conflict with Jesus, but I don't think they're necessarily as simple as a two-dimensional bad guy. You know, it's not a comic book. There's a little bit more depth here, and there's more going on than just that. So let's pick up verse 4. Jesus says, "And they tie up heavy burdens and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as their finger. And they do all their deeds to be noticed by other people, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They love the place of honor at banquets and the seats of honor in the synagogues and personal greetings in the marketplace and being called rabbi by the people. But as for you, do not be called rabbi, for only one is your teacher, and you are all brothers and sisters. And do not call anyone on your earth father, for only one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called leaders, for only one is your leader, that is Christ. But the greatest of you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted." Let's stop right there again. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on people's shoulders. What does that mean? They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on people's shoulders. What's he talking about? Making rules for other people. You've famously all heard this. I'm not going to beat it because most of y'all in here have heard this story. But the Pharisees would create rules to keep you from breaking the rules. And so there were literally hundreds of rules that were set up to keep you from breaking a commandment. And so a commandment like remember the Sabbath and keep it holy ended up having all these rules about how far you could walk, what you could cook, what you could not cook, how many things you could do. I mean, remember how many times Jesus gets into conflict with these people over doing things on the Sabbath. Because he's not breaking God's law, but he's breaking all the rules that they've put up around this as a hedge around God's law. And Jesus says those are burdens that they're placing on people. They do their deeds to be noticed by other people, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. Now, we don't get that because we don't live that way. The phylacteries are these little boxes that they would wear on their heads, and they were a symbol of spirituality. They were supposed to have the portions of the law stuck inside these little boxes. And so, I know it seems silly to us, but it was cultural, and to them it was a big deal. And so, if you had a bigger box on your head, what does that mean? Well, obviously, you had more scripture in your box, and so you were more spiritual than a person with a little bitty box. Makes sense, right? They broadened their phylacteries. The tassels had to do with prayer. And so if you had more tassels or longer tassels or, better tassels or, the tassels, then you were obviously more spiritual because you were more prayerful than somebody else. And so but Jesus says they're doing all these things to be seen by others. They're doing all these things so people will look at them and go, look at how spiritual they are. So now my question is this morning, how do Christians today identify themselves as spiritually superior to other people? What do we do that we use like phylacteries and tassels that we do so that people will look at us and think, oh, look how much more spiritual so-and-so is than everybody else. What's that? Go to church. Okay. But going to church in itself doesn't make me superior, does it? A lot of people will think that way. Okay, Ernie, you had your hand up. Maybe what you say. Okay, talking about what I do, making sure everybody knows what I do. Carrying a Bible everywhere. Okay, that's true. Bigger contributions. Uh-oh. Now she's going to get to preaching here. Because there are a lot of people who will use that. I've seen that thrown at a lot of church leaders. I'm gonna withhold my contribution unless you do what I want you to do, what I told you I wanted you to do. And making sure that everybody knows that my contribution is what it is and those kind of things. Judgment. That's a good one. Removing themselves completely from the world. Segregating myself so that I don't come into contact with anybody who is not a Christian or a believer. And there's something to be said about that, but then you become a monk, I guess. I mean, and how are you going to let your light shine if you're never around people who are in darkness? I buy that. Stephen? Wow. He says he's got an aunt that believes she's more religious or spiritual than everybody because of how she sets her table in preparation for the Sabbath. Okay, I buy that. I know preachers who don't do anything without posting it on Facebook. Prayer breakfast with my brothers this morning, and look at what I'm doing here, and look at how great I am there, and I don't know, maybe they're just trying to shine their light. God bless them. I'm not going to judge them, but at some point, does everybody need to know everything you're doing? I mean, the left hand doesn't know what the right, I don't know. But anyway, but yeah, those kind of things are what we're talking about. That we're doing this to be seen. We're doing this to be for you to look and go, oh, look how spiritual so-and-so is. I'll be honest with you, there have been times in worship where I am in the moment and I'm singing and I'm really feeling it and I really want to lift my hands. But I've seen so many people do it in such a manner that they consider themselves better than others that I won't. And this is my issue. This is not anybody else's issue. This is just Jeff's. I don't think anybody's going to throw rocks at me or anything like that if I do that. This is Jeff's issue. But I won't do it because I don't want people to think that I'm trying to look holier than somebody else. Does that make sense? I went to church with a preacher, and every Sunday he would, before his lesson, kneel down on the stage and pray. And I thought it was really, really cool. And I tried it one time, and I felt so self-conscious, and I felt like I was trying to look some kind of part, and I never did it since because it just felt wrong. And I'm not judging him. I thought it was really cool the way he did it, and I was impressed by it. But for me, it didn't feel genuine. It felt like I was trying to put on a show, and I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be what Jesus is condemning here. And so, I don't know. We sometimes I guess that can hold us back, but trying not to have a big phylactery. Oh yeah, I know. I've been there, and I'm not trying to judge anybody else's heart. This is just talking about Jeff and what's going on in Jeff's head. Because I don't have any way of knowing what people are doing. Jesus shuns specific titles: rabbi, teacher, leader, father. And that's interesting because we in Churches of Christ have made a point of trying not to have titles. People struggle with, I'll go out among other denominations and they'll say, well, what do they call you? I mean, do I call you pastor? Do I call you, what do your people call you? And I always say, you mean to my face? Or, but they don't know because you're supposed to have a title. And are you Reverend Dunn? Are you Pastor Dunn? I'm like, I'm Jeff. Let's just go with that. But for the most part, it's weird, and we don't do that because we're trying to be special, but it's because of this passage that I don't want to be considered that I'm in some way super Christian because I stand on a stage and talk about the Word of God. I'm not. I'm not any holier than anybody. I'm just a guy that gets paid to talk. Eugene, you had your hand up. Everybody was brother and sister back in the day, including the preacher. And then, but at some point, then that gets to be one of those things where I'm more spiritual than you because I call you brother. And where do we draw the line? You know what I mean? If I call you, and I don't know, because then we get into this self-consciousness of what am I doing this to be to everybody to think that I'm cool or spiritual, or am I doing it? And it's hard. And where do we? I don't know, Jason.
I think in some ways, it's like if you're doing that, if you've grown up since a child and you're doing that your whole life, it becomes second nature to you. Just like the guy you said that was kneeling on the stage.
Yeah,
Maybe he's done that his whole life.
absolutely.
And then when you get it and not doing it your whole life up until that point, it made you feel weird. And maybe someone like I'm not used to calling people brother, but there are certain people that will call me brother, and I appreciate that.
Right.
And then sometimes, I find myself calling other people brother or sister. And it's not that I feel weird, but it's like I feel different because I'm really not used to like doing that.
Right, right. And so it also is what your comfort level is. I mean, I told you, I correct, I will say something to preachers who call me Pastor Jeff, but then it wasn't long ago that I took a whole bunch of teenagers somewhere, and there was a bunch of them who were not members of our church, and they all called me Pastor Jeff, and I didn't correct them because they were doing it as a symbol of respect. It wasn't something that they were trying to put on me. They didn't mean anything by it. They didn't know what else to call me. It was just like saying Mr. Dunn. And so I was okay with that. I didn't make a big deal out of it because they weren't making a big deal out of it. It wasn't their problem. And so I didn't want to put burdens on them, and then I'm doing the same thing that, okay. So let's move on, because now we're going to get into the woes. And this is the good stuff, starting at verse 13. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut the kingdom of heaven in front of people. For you do not enter it yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that's nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And you say, whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the offering that is on it is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore, the one who swears by the altar swears both by the altar and by everything on it. And the one who swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells in it. And the one who swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they're full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may also become clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to people, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs for the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, and you say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers, you snakes, you offspring of vipers. How will you escape the sentence of hell? Wow. I mean, you talk about fire and brimstone. Jesus lays it down. I think we've got to go through this, and we won't cover all of it today because there's a lot here. But we have to start out with the question, what's a woe? Because I don't know about you, but I'm not in the habit of pronouncing woes on people. I don't use that word a whole lot. So what exactly is a woe? A woe comes from the Hebrew word hoi, which literally means it's an expression of grief. It's an expression of despair. Now, my life, I've read these as woe was like a point or a curse or somehow a jab, but he's really not. He's really, it's an expression of grief. It's an expression of sorrow. It's my heart breaks for you, you Pharisees, you hypocrites, because of these things. And so that makes these take on a little bit different connotation. He's still slamming them, but this is This is the job of a prophet. If you go back through the Old Testament and the Hebrew Scriptures, the prophets would pronounce woes on those who were outside the will of God. I'll give you one example in Isaiah 5. Isaiah 5, verse 8 and 9. Woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field, until there is no more room, until you're made to dwell alone in the midst of the land. The Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing, surely many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitant. Isaiah's predicting the exile, okay? And that's an expression of grief. Again in Isaiah 5, woe to those who rise early in the morning, that they may run after strong drink, who tarry late into the evening as wine inflames them. They have lyre and harp and tambourine and flute and wine at their feast, but they do not regard the deeds of the Lord. Again, this is a proclamation. This is a prophetic utterance, okay? And so this is something the prophets would do. Remember, we talked about it. From the moment Jesus has come into Jerusalem, he has assumed that mantle. He's assumed that role of prophet. He is very much doing things along the lines of those Old Testament prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, those guys. He is very much taking on the role of a prophet. And that's what he's doing here with pronouncing these woes. He is pronouncing judgment, but really he is pronouncing grief because they are so outside of the will of God. The first woe, you shut the kingdom of heaven in front of people, for you do not enter it yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. They are hindering the normal, common people from being part of the kingdom of God. Because of their rules, because of their regulations, because of the barriers that they have set up, they are keeping people separated from God. You have made it so difficult that you yourself can't come in, and you keep everybody else from coming in. So now, as we go through these, I want us to kind of turn that flashlight back on ourselves. How do we keep people from entering the kingdom? What barriers do we as Christians set up that keep people apart from God? Nobody wants to answer that one. That's all right. Won't let people into church based on how they dress. That's a common one, unfortunately. And then, I see the opposite too, because you got the guy in the modern churches that gets up and preaches and looks like he just got out of bed. And that's what he wore, all day yesterday, and he hadn't even took a shower. I mean, I don't know if that's Kara had her hand up over here. Making church a holy temple, the place where you have to come to bring your offering, rather than church being a group of people who go out into the world to be salt and light and to bring the kingdom to people. Absolutely, that's a good one. I had more hands, but I don't know where they went. No, I didn't. Y'all said it all. We could sit here. Oh, I'm sorry, Mary. Absolutely. Yeah. Y'all don't belong here. It was just Carrie. They wanted you. It was just Carrie they were just looking at. Right. One of the greatest things that I hear commonly is people will tell me who are first-time visitors, this is the friendliest church I've ever been to. And that thrills my heart. Because whether they choose to stay here or not, I don't care. But if you come into this building and you are not greeted or welcomed or made to feel like you belong here, then we failed something. We need to be people that are showing hospitality. That's literally something that we're told to do in Scripture. And so I agree with you. Jason and then Katie.
That's exactly how I felt when I first went to Prison Drive Church of Christ in Kentucky. Just felt so welcome and loved by these people that didn't even know me.
Awesome.
And then I felt the exact same way when I first started coming here.
And see, that's what you want to hear. That I felt like I was welcomed and belonged. Katie? Yeah. Right. Yep. I agree. It's a heart thing, because I don't know, Megan.
Yeah, and it's so important for us to focus on what brings us together rather than things that divide us. When we bring up politics,
Absolutely.
when we bring up opinions that are not biblical, everybody gets uncomfortable. When we bring up positions that aren't of biblical, everybody gets uncomfortable. So when we concentrate on the one thing that brings us all together, is God.
Absolutely.
I feel like we can grow and we can accept other people and we can be, what God has called us to be as a church.
Keep our focus on Jesus. I totally agree with you. So, there are things that we have to be. Oh, I'm sorry, Jim.
We met with Christians in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Okay.
I guess a lot of folks would think that New York is pretty difficult place.
Right. Yep. Uh huh. Wow.
Just as an example, this is not intended to be braggadocious, just an example. When we left there, we knew a couple who provided food to the West Point group,
Mm-hmm.
and they presented us with a piece of artwork.
Really?
Yes.
That's really cool. Mm-hmm. That's really cool. That's and so it doesn't take a lot for us to be able to welcome people. It's just that heart. And I think that's what all of y'all are talking about, that we have that heart that's focused on Jesus, that's focused on what unites us rather than what divides us. And we start there and welcome people based on that. We're out of time, and so I'm going to stop there. We'll start with verse 15 next time because there's a lot to unpack there, and if we go down that road, we'll be here for a while. Thank you for your participation this morning. Again, chapter 23, verse 15. We'll talk about missions next week. We'll start there, so that'll be fun. So you got about 15 minutes. Go take care of your business. Welcome somebody. Make somebody feel loved. Come back in here at 10 o'clock for worship.